Let's talk about state setup and teardown. So, as I mentioned earlier, right, we're trying to isolate components and want to make sure that we test the unit test. We test the component in a known state, right? We want to know that we're controlling fully the conditions in which the component is being tested, right? And we want to make sure that once we test a particular use case, right, that we set up we want to make sure that we set up the state, that we know what the current state is, right, that we simulate what the events might be, and that we verify that the resulting state is correct, right? But typically we don't just have one test, we have lots and lots of tests, right? Maybe testing the same exact component multiple times for different states, for different edge cases, for different behaviors, for different functionality, different events that occur, and we want to make sure that each one of those tests in a test suite, that they themselves are isolated from each other, right? That the whatever side effects of one test, we don't want those side effects to spoil all our other tests, right? So oftentimes what we want to do is that whatever unit test that we're running, we're going to set up the test and then clean up after ourselves, clean up after after the test runs, in case there was any side effect left over by the test itself. Okay, so the process of isolating unit tests, so that they start from a known test, and then we clean up any side effects, is often referred to as setup and tear down. You set up the test and then you tear down the test. Okay, and again, this is not necessarily just UI, user interface unit testing. This is the case as well in JUnit or many other testing environments. It's a common capability that and very common practice, right? Whenever we're implementing unit tests, right? Now there's all sorts of possibilities on how is it that we can isolate one test from another test. The more common one is that we the framework will allow us to execute a piece of code at the beginning, right before any one of the tests runs, right? So that before any of the test runs, the test harness will invoke this function at the beginning of every single test, right? So that we make sure that we load up any resources that we might need, that we're ready, right, at the beginning of a particular at the beginning of any one of the tests. So here, for instance, we have setup before each. So we have two tests here, test 1 and test 2, and notice that setup is executed twice, right, before any one of the tests executes it, and then notice that there's also a teardown that executes at the end, right after every single test. So there's a setup and a teardown before each test and after each test, right? If you have 10 tests, this would execute again 10 times, right? Before and after, before and after, before and after. So you set up, tear down, set up, and tear down. And again, the idea is that you want to isolate any side effect that test 1 might have against test 2. And oftentimes, these tests would be designed in such a way that they are independent from each other, right? That it doesn't really matter which test you run first, right? That because there shouldn't be anything left over that would affect any one of the other tests. Now, sometimes you do want tests to share, certain attributes, certain states, certain things instead of typically, running these pieces of code before and after every single test. Sometimes you can get away with just running it before all the tests and then tear down after all the tests, right? Oftentimes these are resources that you need to load. They're very expensive resources, maybe some expensive network connection or maybe some expensive database access, right? That you need to do a query that takes a long time, that you want to query it once and then maybe keep it around in some local variable in the test suite, which is then shared amongst all the different tests. So we have here test 1, 2, 3, 4, sharing, whatever setup was created before all of them, and then it's removed, and we clean up after it. We close networks, we close files, we close database connections and whatnot, right? So it's to clean up after the test. Now you could do a mixture of both, where you might have a before all, and then an in-between of setup for each. And then you also can group tests together. Like you can group test 1, 2, 3 all together. You run them all and have a before each that is specific to the group itself, as opposed to each individual test. And so there's a lot of options on how is it that we can group things together that might share common setups and common teardowns. Now, to support this behavior, Jest, the library we started looking at last week, provides functions such as before all, after all, before each, and after each. Now, this is common to most test harnesses. So JUnit will have the similar thing. Karma and many other libraries, Jasmine, they will have similar support, for this kind of behavior. And again, before all, is invoked before all the tests. After all is invoked after all the tests, and then before each and after each is invoked before and after every single test. So let's look at a couple examples here. Here's an example of using, here's a test unit where the test suite that has two tests, right? And the tests, presumably, they verify that the following are cities that can be found in a particular database. So we need to load the database, right? And the database might be something expensive that you need to go out and through a network and fetch the data. So it's very expensive. Maybe you want to load it just once, and it's the same database for all your tests in your test suite. And so here we're loading all the city database. We run the test. We're checking to see that Vienna and San Juan are indeed cities in the database, and then we clean up. We let go of any connections to a database and let go of resources. Or we might choose to do it for every single test as opposed to loading it just once. Instead, we can implement it this other way, where we load the database and clear out the city database for every single test. So right before this test, and then we clear it out, and then again we load it again, right, for this test, and then clear it out. Again, it's your choice on what granularity do you need. Let's look at an example of grouping multiple tests as a single unit test. Right, so for instance, you can use the describe function to group multiple tests as if it were one single test. And so, for instance, you can name the group, right, by just like you would as a regular test. And then notice that it's just a function, right? It looks very, very similar to just any other assert or any other test and you can also declare it before each for the whole group, right? Meaning that it's going to be invoked for every single element inside of that group. Here we're verifying that Vienna loves sausages and that San Juan loves mofongo. Yeah. Just to give you a very abstract example on what this might look like when you run it, here I have a color-coded a simple set of tests. We only have two tests here. We have here test 1, right, and we have test 2 over here. Just two tests. But we have declared all the combinations of before all, after all, before each, after each, and then the same thing for this test inside of the describe, right? With again, inside of the describe, you have before all functions that are specific to this particular set of tests. Here if you had more tests, they were all inside of that single describe. Also notice that I've tagged them with 1 and 2, right? So that in the next slide we can see how this would print out. right? And I've color-coded it so we can follow along. But before we see the solution, notice that let's try and do this. So before we get to this test here, as the name suggests, before all seems that it would execute before everything, right? That before any tests are executed, the before all would execute, and the after all, we would expect that it's the very last thing that would execute, right? And indeed, that's what happens, right? Before all is the very first thing that happens, and the after all is the very last thing that happens. And what about this before each? Before each literally means that it will execute before every single test, whether it's inside of the describe or it's outside of describe, right? So for this particular test, you have the before each will run, right? And right after this test completes, the after each will run. And finally it gets to the describe. In the describe, what will happen is that first the before all will happen, and the after all will happen right after the test. So before all, right? The before each will happen. The before each that's described out here will happen, and then the test executes, and then the after each, and the after all will execute right after the test, and finally the after all at the bottom, something like that. Let's see what we look like. We have the two tests. The only two tests here are this test 1 and test 2 here. Right? We have the before all over there matched with the after all, which is down here. Notice the nesting here, right? All the nesting. Notice this test inside of the describe. You have the before each and the after each that are inside of the describe. You have the before each and the after each that are described outside of the describe. And then you have the before all and the after all, which is described inside of the describe. Inside of the describe. Right? So this test, core test, right? It has 3 befores and 3 afters, right, that execute for that one test. Okay. So again, you can this allows you a quite granular control on how you can isolate each unit test from other unit tests, right? So that they're not trampling on each other, and that they're not leaving any side effects that would invalidate your tests. Okay.